Welcome to another edition of In the News. I'm Micah Halpern, sitting in for Mark Golub. Today, what we'd like to raise is an essential question about the issue of ISIS and Israel, its relationship with Israel. Before we bring in our very special guest, I want to set the tone, if I could, and set the picture of what's happening. Principally, one has to realize that ISIS is a major challenge to the West, to the Western world, to Israel, to the United States, because of competing ideas and values, because of different perspectives of how the world should work. But what is this ISIS? The name itself, ISIS, actually is a misnomer. It stands for the Islamic State, Iraq, and Syria. And that's really untrue, but you'll see it also referred to as ISIL, the Islamic State of Islam in Levant. Levant is the greater area, sort of the French term for the region that includes Iraq, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Cyprus, Israel, Palestine, and a huge swath of area. Now they've proclaimed themselves IS, the Islamic State, with a leader, a caliphate, al-Baghdadi, a character who literally wants to bring this movement to a whole new era. Khalif in Arabic actually means successor. He sees himself as the successor of Muhammad himself. And so what we have is a movement which is generating tremendous money, tremendous resources, and a lot of volunteers joining the fight against the infidels, which in some ways are Muslims, in some ways are Christians, Yazidis, Jews, and of course the Western world in general. What I want to do for the next few minutes is to bring in a very special guest, Dan Raviv. Dan is the national correspondent for CBS. He is a voice of insight and reason, someone I've known for a very long time. Author of a spectacular book, which, by the way, I would note, just to plug it, I also reviewed the book and reviewed it very, very positively. A book called Spies Against Armageddon, The Complete History of Israel's Intelligence Community. It's a book about the history of the intel community of Israel itself, its great elements and its black eyes, you should note. I want to bring in Dan now, if I could. Dan, are you there?
Absolutely, and you know what you say about Israeli intelligence reminds me that whether it's you or me as an analyst, or whether it's the United States or the Israeli government trying to figure out what's going on, nobody's perfect. So sometimes there are black eyes, but maybe we need to recognize basically, Micah, who are the good guys and who are the bad guys.
Well, black eyes and all, exactly. Yeah. I want to begin, actually, if we could. You have a unique and important perspective on ISIS. Could you bring forth your thesis to the viewing audience as we begin the discussion?
Well, I'm thinking in terms of what intelligence agencies can do, and it's not impossible to counter ISIS. It's not going to be taken care of in a couple of days. It's not like an episode of Homeland on TV or even 13 episodes. It will require patience. But look at this, for instance. The Islamic State, as an organization, welcomes volunteers. They obviously want Westerners to join them, outsiders to join them, all sorts of Muslims from all over the world to join them. That means they're actually open to penetration, right? I mean, think about all the spy books and spy movies. There's a lot of reality there. And so Western, and if they care to, even the Israeli intelligence agencies could potentially penetrate ISIS by planting people inside. In addition, we've learned, well, basically because of Edward Snowden, the big NSA leaker, what it is that intelligence agencies can do in terms of electronics, eavesdropping, picking up signals, intercepting emails, unless a terrorist organization refuses to use cell phones and computers. But that's certainly not true in the case of IS or ISIS. They're sending out videos, you know, even of beheadings, videos, other items on the Internet meant to scare all of us. Well, that actually gives counterterrorism organizations like the CIA a chance to follow them and see where their leaders are. I'm sure that that's the big effort, and I think there are a lot of opportunities there. It's not impossible to weaken ISIS. I trust that the intelligence communities of the United States, the United Kingdom, and to some extent Israel are doing so. One last thing, Micah, that I would say, you know, from the outset, I don't think it's the top priority for Israel. Israel has its more local Palestinian problem, Gaza, of course, and worrying about Iran and its nuclear bomb. But Israel still is watching Syria and ISIS as carefully as it can.
Well, let's focus for a second, if we could, on the European angle, if we could. Why? Because they seem to be feeling it much more personally than America, certainly, and as well as Israel, because many of the people who are actually volunteering from abroad are coming in from Europe itself. There was just the report of a 16-year-old French girl who was arrested in Nice on her way to volunteer for the ISIS. Are they on top of this? Are the French on top of this, do you think?
I think pretty well. The fact is that the security agencies in the big Western European countries don't have many legal limits. They're actually less controlled than the agencies here in the United States. So the British and French intelligence, they do watch their own citizens. If their citizens travel to places like Syria and Iraq, again, nobody's perfect, but recently in the British Parliament, the Prime Minister, David Cameron, says it's estimated there are 500 British citizens who went to Syria and Iraq to join the jihad, to feel that they are part of a holy war, 500 Brits, even more French citizens and citizens of other European countries. Of course, we know what their main concern is, that those Westerners, after learning how to fight and kill, and be willing to die also, let's say on battlefields in Syria, may well go back to their home countries, Britain, France, other ones in Europe, or could even use their British passport to come pretty easily to the United States and stage an attack, maybe a suicide attack. I find a little bit of, well, strange comfort in the recent reports that some American citizens died in battle in Syria. A lot of publicity, you know, for one man named Douglas MacArthur McCain, who divided his time between Minnesota and San Diego, and he died in battle, as the ISIS activists say, in Syria. It makes me think, what do you know? At least at this stage, even the Westerners who join ISIS, they're being used in Syria, and they're dying there. Okay, that gives me a little bit of comfort that so far they're not perhaps activating a plan to send the Westerners to the Western countries. But Europe's taking it very seriously, and the Brits believe that they can actually modify their law to make it possible to take away the British passport of British citizens so that they don't travel on. The citizen then could go to court and make a counterclaim, etc. But that's something the British government plans to do, and in England, the Prime Minister has an automatic majority in Parliament. It's not like over here with the President and Congress. So the British government really will try just that, stripping passports. Is
it possible, and this is interesting, not just in terms of Europe, but also in terms of America, to get it to clip it even a step before that, before they go over, but actually in the recruitment process? How much do we know about the recruitment process of these jihadists who are recruiting fighters from our classrooms, literally, or actually even more so from our computer screens, and convincing them to move on through Turkey into Syria and into Iraq? Can we stop that, or can we monitor that?
Well, it seems to me, Micah, that is often a very private process, very difficult to pick up. I think even of the Fort Hood massacre a few years ago, and the killer there was an Army major, an Army psychiatrist, Major Nidal Hassan.
Psychologist.
Yeah, he'd been in touch by email with al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and its American-born leader, al-Awlaki, who later was killed by a U.S. drone strike. And so Major Hassan, had email contact with al-Awlaki, and, even though he was an Army officer, that wasn't picked up. Just imagine the average citizen who is emailing back and forth. If it's with a known jihadi, a known Islamic radical in Europe or in the Middle East, that might be picked up, and then the FBI might watch that person in the U.S., and that has happened. The FBI typically then will spring a sting operation, sending an FBI agent who pretends to be an Islamic recruiter and therefore catch that person, and there have been successes like that, but I would not expect a 100% success rate.
It's a problem because you're right. It is an issue of people's privacy. But on the other hand, it's those worlds, it's those boards, those message boards, those interactions which are creating this verve and excitement about going out there and fighting a cause. I wonder
Sure. Well, we should try to keep watch on all those message boards and try to know who is going to them. And if it's someone in the United States, well, it's rather obvious to me now, Micah, that kind of Internet activity can be monitored and traced by the National Security Agency. Now, under the post-Snowden reforms, it'll be a little harder for government authorities to get a court warrant to actually monitor the activities of U.S. citizens on the Internet, but that warrant can be obtained, and I think if there are leads in which U.S. citizens are going to websites or individuals overseas using the Internet, email, social networking, that can be picked up, and I bet you court warrants would be granted.
I would guess so. Let me move on now, if I could, to the actual brutality of ISIS, if possible, and specifically to the beheading of Stephen Sotloff. Now, what's interesting here is that, and I don't know how public it's become, but Sotloff spent a significant amount of time in Israel learning at the Interdisciplinary Center. I don't know if you're aware of that. And got a graduate degree there. And from there spun off to the rest of the Arabic world where he was covering. They kept that quiet until just now, until only minutes ago, I believe. It's very interesting. There was an Israeli connection to Sotloff himself, not just as an American Jew who would have affinity towards Israel, but actually was connected in both his studies as well as in living, and then was able to, from there, jump to various places in the Middle East. As you know, having spent significant time in the Middle East, it's a good jumping point to begin your coverage of places. Do you know anything about the Sotloff story itself?
Well, to some extent. I mean, I know what you were just saying, and I'm sure the viewers of Shalom TV are starting to pick up reports on that Stephen Sotloff, who was beheaded, the second journalist murdered on video by that British accented masked killer who says he represents the Islamic State. Sotloff did spend a lot of time in Israel. Israeli newspapers say that, in fact, he had dual nationality. He took Israeli citizenship after making Aliyah, but still wanted to be a war correspondent who went to Libya and went to Syria, obviously feeling that the so-called Arab Spring and all the reforms and changes in the Arab world would be a magnificent story that he'd want to cover on the ground. As a freelancer, which is dangerous, difficult, typically not well paid, so he must have been unbelievably interested in the Middle East. Yes, we know quite a few Jewish Americans, often young journalists, are really interested in the Middle East. Some of them decide to become correspondents in Israel and will sharpen their Hebrew, and some of them also become interested in the Arab world and will sharpen their Arabic and go see some of the action, which includes brutality and bloodshed in Arab countries. Now, I'll imagine that the Islamic State kidnappers in Syria got the truth out of him. I'll imagine, maybe so, that Sotloff was Jewish. To us, perhaps the name and the fact that he's Stephen Joel Sotloff from Miami is obvious. So perhaps they knew, but they didn't make it part of their propaganda.
Why not?
They
Why
were
do you
using
think not?
Sotloff as an American, exactly the same as they used James Foley, the fervent Roman Catholic from New England. It just didn't make a difference. They were being used as Americans. And the next victim, it was suggested in the latest ISIS video, the next victim would be some British man who was kidnapped in Syria. So they're trying to make the political impact on the U.S. and Britain to stop attacking the Islamic State fighters in Iraq and to get out of the entire Middle East. I'm sure, Micah, you'd agree that even if the U.S. stopped the airstrikes against ISIS in Iraq, ISIS would find some other reason to kidnap and kill Western hostages. This is their latest excuse. Stop bombing us in Iraq, they say.
Oh, there is no question. You're absolutely on target on this issue. I'm so interested in the question as to whether or not the fulcrum or the device of the Jewish identity and the Israeli identity of a prisoner who also is an American, how they would play the ISIS in their own minds, how they would play each angle, and chose the American angle instead of the other, especially given the need to recruit, and how, in many ways, the magnet of Israel as the evil component is so well used as a storyline, as a narrative in so many parts of that world in order to gather support.
But Micah, I'll bet you in their minds, as ISIS activists look at this, the United States is the big devil. You know, used to be called the Great Satan as far as Iran was concerned. They also would call the U.S. a devil, and ISIS would think that America is the big problem, and they would portray Israel, by the way, as a junior partner, and eventually their caliphate will turn its attention to try to wipe out Israel and replace it with an Arab Muslim state of Palestine, but it's not their highest priority. And so America is their big target, and they probably think even for recruitment that let's say Muslims in Western Europe also see America as the big problem. Yeah, in part being Israel's big sponsor. So as they see it, America's their target. By the way, that is an easy leap to trying to attack inside the United States, and that's why the Obama administration is so concerned that ISIS is a danger not only in Syria and Iraq, but eventually, if they haven't already begun, they will be ambitious enough to send somebody to attack inside the U.S.
Oh, well, that is a very important element and a perfect segue into our next discussion. What really is the threat to America? Americans seem so isolated, so insular, so removed from the discussion. Even when we watch the pictures of the brutal executions of these Americans, it just seems so far away. Americans and even American leadership, we're hearing it on several stations, but the brutality is not. We're not hearing not just a frustration. We're not hearing a call to arms or action. When is there going to be an action that takes place beyond a distance?
Well, I don't read it the same as you. Congress has been out of session for more than a month and is returning to town. I'm speaking to you from Washington, D.C. And already, when both Democrats and Republicans have been asked about the beheading videos, first of Mr. Foley and then of Mr. Sotloff, members of Congress in both parties have said ISIS is a challenge to the U.S., and that the U.S. should be more militant and more active, and that maybe we don't know exactly what our secret services are doing, like the CIA, and what special operators in the U.S. military may be doing. Because, listen, Micah, after the Foley beheading, it came out that there was a United States Delta Force, may have also involved Navy SEALs, raid into Syria to try to rescue Mr. James Foley and other hostages, probably including Sotloff, at the beginning of this summer. And so the U.S. military is doing more than you realize. Members of Congress are calling for more action. Even a Democrat who ordinarily loves President Obama, Senator Dianne Feinstein, said on one of the Sunday TV shows that President Obama tends to be cautious, maybe too cautious.
Right.
So they're trying to spur the Obama administration into more action. And one other thing, also recently, the president authorized a strike that must have seemed like out of the blue in Northeast Africa, in Somalia, where drones were used in order to fire missiles at cars containing al-Shabaab leaders. And it is believed, though not yet confirmed, that the leader of that organization, which staged a lot of terrorism, including the horrible attack on the shopping center in Nairobi, Kenya, probably was killed by the U.S. drone strike. So I'm just going to tell you the U.S. is doing more than all of our citizens may realize. It may not always be at the top of people's agenda that Americans would be in danger if we just let these terrorist organizations run amok. I think the U.S. is doing a lot. And, we'll hear, maybe there'll even be congressional hearings that will reveal a little more about what we're doing.
That might actually happen. Let me change gears, if I could, for a second and move to a parallel that's been made very often in the Israeli press, and certainly by the Prime Minister of Israel, where he's arguing that Hamas is their ISIS, is Israel's ISIS. What do you think about that? And is there truth to it? Especially when you saw, I'm sure you did see, yesterday's New York Times that has a large ad comparing the execution of collaborators by Hamas and the execution of Foley by ISIS.
Yeah, wasn't that an amazing pictorial, even when it was on the front page of the New York Times, showing the Hamas executions of alleged collaborators in Gaza City. You know, the killers dressed all in black, the victims hooded and being mistreated clearly, and it made you think that, oh, wow, these Hamas executioners and killers are just as bad as ISIS.
Right, they're both kneeling, they're kneeling, their hands are behind their backs.
New York Times.
Yeah, they're both kneeling, their hands are behind their backs, their, the hoods, the parallels are so remarkable.
Okay, so a picture is a picture tells a story and is worth thousands of words and all that other stuff. We could take a more serious look at the desires and objectives of those organizations, but I think you have to keep in mind that Hamas is part of Palestinian politics. And even what Israel wants to do is make Hamas lose, kill their leaders if possible, so that the Palestinian Authority, the relative moderates, the relative good guys, maybe can even take charge in Gaza. And then if you're really an optimist, you know, maybe Israel actually could get back to negotiating with the good guys, with the Palestinian Authority, because a lot of people believe, whether you're from the right or the left, that Israel, you know, could get something out of negotiating future Palestinian state. Well, you know, if you're a right-wing Israeli politician, you don't really want that, but you do recognize usually that Ramallah is a bit, well, more than a bit more moderate than Hamas. Okay, I got you. ISIS, on the other hand, is like got these world ambitions. You know, they want to unite the entire Arab world in a Muslim caliphate. They don't even care about borders. They probably would want to attack in the United States. So ISIS is potentially bigger, with no legitimate nationalism that any of us can respect. But sure, I'll say that for Israel, you know, Hamas, if they were to get on Israeli territory, of course they'd slaughter Jews, and I think you could say the same about Hezbollah in Lebanon. Sure, a political faction in Lebanon, but also a terrorist group. If they could, they would kill as many Israelis and Jews as they could.
Interesting. I saw a piece, an old piece by Mohammed Deif, who was one of the leaders of Hamas, who may or may not have been killed in one of the strikes against Hamas by Israel, who not just a leader, saw himself as the military leader of Hamas, who actually was presenting in his presentation, very interestingly, his desire to be the Khalif of the Islamic world, to actually unite the whole Islamic world around the Palestinian cause, in many ways similar to the way in which we're hearing Baghdadi speak as the Khalif of the Islamic State, which is very interesting. Did you see that piece, or are you aware of that piece?
Yeah, I'm aware of it. So, but what does it remind me of? You know, people, whether they're terrorists, political activists, you know, people who feel they're winning or losing their battle. It's, you know, what it is to me, Micah. It's a revolutionary environment in Gaza. A lot of people wondered during the 51-day Gaza war, you know, why wouldn't Hamas agree to a ceasefire? Don't they mind more than 2,000 people dying, including certainly hundreds of Hamas fighters, including some of their leaders? Don't they mind? No, it's part of the struggle to them. To a degree, they are suicidal. They used to send suicide attackers into pizzerias and buses and to that Passover Seder in the hotel in Netanya. You know, that's Hamas for you. No, they don't care about life. Death is part of their revolutionary struggle, and they think that makes them more courageous, and they're also going to voice these huge ambitions, as you said. Now, Mohammed Deif, as far as Israeli intelligence is concerned, you know, he got his answer. You know, he got a missile strike, you know, right on his home. The Israelis believe he's at least incredibly crippled and probably out of the game, and maybe he's dead. And the Israelis say that's going to be our answer. When one of the really bad guys is too active but then too visible, you know, we're going to get him. A lot of people think Israel at the same time should offer the softer side. We're also interested in talks and negotiations and all that. That clearly is what the United States government is encouraging. Be tough on terrorists, but always be open to negotiations with the relative moderates.
It's an interesting challenge, and it's a challenge because Americans have difficulty ferreting out the very issue that you tried just now to develop. The difference between different aspects of the Palestinian polity and different aspects of terror around the world. And it's very, very interesting because from the sheer point of view of death, the glorification of death is very clear. Both Hamas and ISIS glorify death. But they have completely different perspectives. And the interesting question will be, whether or not American leadership can make that sort of nuanced distinction, or whether or not they will just say, no, this is your problem, Israel, and this is our problem for the rest of the world.
Well, yeah, that's a tough one. And one of the big factors, not fully recognized, Micah, is that President Obama will only hold that office till January of 2017. Just about 2.5 years to go, less than 2.5 years. And so I think he's starting to look at the world differently. No way should Iran develop nuclear weapons while he's president. He'll keep his pledge. After that, it'll be someone else's headache. He will stand up for Israel's right to defend itself while criticizing Israel for expanding settlements or recently taking more land in the West Bank as state land.
Yes.
So he'll stand for the usual U.S. policies, a mix of supporting Israel but criticizing Israeli policies. But Mr. Obama doesn't want things to blow up. He doesn't want things to go too crazy in any of the Arab countries. He had decided for a while to tolerate the Syrian civil war, even though almost 200,000 people have been killed in Syria in 3.5 years of civil war. But now that ISIS has grown, that's become probably impossible to tolerate.
Right.
So I don't think our president wants to do too much in that region, just kind of keep a lid on things. But ISIS, and even the beheading of the American journalists in those horrible videos, I think that forces his hand to do something. Now, Shalom TV viewers will wonder, will he stand with Israel more or pressure Israel more? Now, I've studied that, too, at my website, IsraelSpy.com, and also a book that I did with Yossi Melman called Friends Indeed, about U.S.-Israel relations. I take from this, from all the patterns, I think actually Mr. Obama will try to be closer to Israel because we need allies in the region.
Thank you.
It won't always be easy because the Netanyahu cabinet may build more settlements or do things that annoy the U.S., but I think the U.S. needs solid allies.
Thank you so very much, Dan. It was a real pleasure to have you on the show and to talk with you about these issues. Good luck.
Fascinating for me, too. Thanks, Micah.
That was Dan Raviv, a national correspondent for CBS, as well as author of numerous books on intelligence, the intelligence community of Israel itself, and really a player, a thinker. I want to conclude, if I could, with a very basic concept. That is, from our discussion with Dan, you could actually see that there's almost a synapse between American concepts and Israeli concepts in terms of understanding ISIS and Hamas. It's going to be a very interesting issue as we see the development over the next few weeks and months as the United States creates some sort of policy on how they handle these issues. So I want to thank you very much for watching this edition of In the News. I'm Micah Halpern, sitting in for Mark Golub.